You may recall a reserved man standing on the far right of the stage if you have ever attended a Deep Purple show after 1994. He remained silent, avoided approaching the crowd, and avoided looking at the camera. However, you may have wondered, who is this guy, as his fingers worked quickly, precisely, and passionately. And why am I unfamiliar with him? Steve Morse is his name. He is not famous. No gimmicks, no noise, no scandals. However, he was once crowned the world's top guitarist by Guitar Player magazine for 5 consecutive years, a distinction that only 3 persons in history have ever held. He once wrote music that had rock, country, jazz, and classical elements, and he rehearsed 10,000 notes per day. Similar to a sound architect. With just his guitar, he once stood in front of a crowd of fans that were there solely to see Ritchie Blackmore and transformed their skepticism into astonishment. Behind that stillness lies a life filled with unusual decisions, a body that is becoming more and more painful every day but never stops playing music, and a heart that chose to leave the spotlight out of love rather than failure. Continue viewing if you believe you already know everything there is to know about guitarists. Because Steve Morse's narrative is only getting started. Childhood. Although Steve Morse was born in Hamilton, Ohio, in 1954, his early years were not spent in a single location. Steve's family relocated frequently from Ohio to Tennessee before settling in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where he initially became interested in music. But unlike other children his age, not through rock or pop. His dad was an old-fashioned minister. There were no Rolling Stones, no Beatles, and most definitely no Hendrix in their house. As an alternative, there were hymns, solemn, serious church tunes, and music that was both grand and melancholy. Steve did not object. He adored listening to it. Maybe that's why Morse's guitar playing would still have a hint of Bach in it, even at his older age. Pure but complex. Peaceful but powerful. Steve, however, required his own room, just like any other child. A personal space of liberty within his mind. In order to covertly listen to the prohibited sounds every night after the lights went off, he concealed a transistor radio beneath his pillow. Soul, rock and roll. And echoes from a world that would never be acceptable to his father. Steve started a band called 3 when he was a teenager, and they performed at high school parties and church halls. His hair, which was long, wavy, and proudly uncut despite school regulations, was what really set him apart, not his playing. He refused to cut his hair, which was the only reason he was expelled in the 10th grade. However, what appeared to be a conclusion instead led to a much larger opportunity. Without even finishing high school, he was accepted straight into the University of Miami's music program after completing the 11th grade at a Catholic school. Steve met the individuals who would transform his life there. Pat Metheny, Jaco Pastorius, and Andy West are all students, but not just any students. Among these were the Banished Boy, Steve Morse, and other musical aliens. Who entered the game without being introduced, played hymns, and had Hendrix-related dreams. Early career Steve Morse wasn't aiming for stardom when attending the University of Miami. He was looking for the kind of musical truth that comes from totally dismantling genres, conventions, and formulas. He never ceased experimenting in labs, workshops, and experimental displays, combining mandolin with distortion, integrating Bach with southern rock, and fusing bluegrass with jazz fusion. Subsequently, he formed Dixie Dregs with his lifelong buddy Andy West, who had been his musical partner since high school. The band's name suggested that they were unconventional, manly, rebellious, and completely unclassifiable. Dixie Dregs was the complete opposite of what was required at an era when music required vocalists, lyrics, and immediate appeal. A band that only plays instruments and has no singer. Where each track developed into a 6 or 7 minute emotional and technical adventure. There are no sing-along choruses or idolized celebrity faces, just sound, unadulterated and unafraid. They signed with the Allman Brothers label, Capricorn Records. When their first album, Free Fall, was released in 1977, almost nobody purchased it. However, Morse was instantly regarded by reviewers as a compositional genius. He wrote all 11 of the songs, and more significantly, he wrote them to push the audience and himself rather than to satisfy. What If, their 1978 follow-up album, demonstrated a noticeable change. More folk, more southern rock, and even a touch of classical music. Despite not making the charts, the band received an invitation to play at the Montreux Jazz Festival. An honor for any service rendered. However, the market was harsh on anything that was difficult to understand. Capricorn failed financially. They left Dixie Dregs stranded. No label, no guidance. They put out 3 additional albums after signing with Arista. Industry standard, Dregs of the Earth, Unsung Heroes. However, they were always pressured to normalize. Arista requested that the band add lyrics and change their name. Add a singer. Steve nodded and quietly kept composing the way he always had. Industry standard, 1982, their final album of that era, was hailed as their pinnacle. Guitar Player magazine named it Guitar Album of the Year. Steve Morse was voted best guitarist in the world, kicking off a 5-year reign that no one could touch in the professional guitar community. But behind that rise was a band exhausted by constant misunderstanding. They broke up quietly without a farewell. And Steve Morse, the man just crowned the top guitarist in America, chose to disappear. Career success. After Dixie Dregs disbanded in the early 1980s, Steve Morse didn't fall into the lull that many musicians face after peaking technically. On the contrary, he entered a new chapter of his career, where music was no longer confined to lab experiments, but instead collided directly with public taste. And it was here that Morse began to reveal a rare gift, reviving bands that seemed drained of energy without ever losing his own identity. In 1986, he joined Kansas, a band once famous for Dust in the Wind and Carry On Wayward Son, but now struggling to find its voice after a series of upheavals. Morse didn't arrive as a savior, but simply as a musician who wrote and played with dedication. And that, precisely, is what helped Kansas escape their creative loop. The song, All I Wanted, co-written by Morse, unexpectedly became the band's final top 20 Billboard hit, a reminder that technique and emotion don't cancel each other out, if placed correctly. Though he only appeared on 2 albums, Power and In the Spirit of Things, Morse left a powerful mark, quiet, unassuming, but the one who pulled Kansas away from the brink. That quiet comeback laid the foundation for the biggest decision of his career, joining Deep Purple in 1994, replacing Ritchie Blackmore, a legend who, to many fans, was irreplaceable. There was no role more pressure-filled, but Morse didn't try to imitate Blackmore. He chose to rewrite from scratch. And Perpendicular, 1996, was the statement. Deep Purple wasn't dead, they were evolving. Tracks like Sometimes I Feel Like Screaming, The Aviator, Vavum, Ted the Mechanic, brought a fresh, modern tone, rich in technique yet still rooted in the band's hard rock soul. Morse didn't overpower, he blended in and elevated. Over the next 28 years, Steve Morse would become the longest-serving member in Deep Purple's history, appearing on 8 studio albums, dozens of live releases, and spending more than 2 decades bringing the band to new generations of fans. And most importantly, he did it without ever needing to be the center of attention. He knew exactly when to step back so the music could step forward. Between tours with Deep Purple, Morse never abandoned his dream of pure creative expression, and thus, Flying Colors was born in 2011. This wasn't a commercial venture, but a gathering of trusted artists. Mike Portnoy, Neil Morse, Dave LaRue, Casey McPherson, musicians Steve respected. Flying Colors felt like an intellectual playground where technical skill wasn't for show, but for storytelling. Their debut album reached the Billboard Hard Rock Top 10. Second Nature 2014 and Third Degree 2019 were both praised by critics as perfect marriages of prog rock and emotional melody, and Morse, as always, didn't need the spotlight. He was the glue, the invisible backbone of it all. From Kansas to Deep Purple to Flying Colors, Steve Morse has never followed a mold. He didn't conform to expectations. He simply, and quietly, turned weary bands into fresher versions of themselves. Through nothing but dedication, precision, and humility. No applause needed, just the chance to be heard. And somehow he made people listen, even when they didn't know his name. Silence sacrifices and unseen pain. When every note comes with pain and a career steps aside for love. For nearly 3 decades on stage with Deep Purple, Steve Morse never showed that he was suffering. The posture stayed the same, quiet, leaning slightly to the right, guitar hanging just below his shoulder, face expressionless. But behind every downstroke, every seemingly effortless pull of the string was a body screaming in pain. Few knew that for over 10 years, Steve had been silently battling severe progressive arthritis. The joints in his hands, especially the wrists, pinky and ring fingers, were losing cartilage. Bone grinding against bone, pain every night, pain when holding objects, pain even when doing nothing. And yet, he kept playing, not out of habit, out of sheer will. He didn't complain, didn't cancel shows, didn't ask for sympathy. Instead, he quietly changed everything so he could keep living with his guitar. He built custom muting devices, relearned how to hold a pick, restructured finger movements to relieve pressure on damaged joints. For songs like Too Many Notes, he even changed his entire technique, from picking to fingerstyle, just to make sure not a single note was lost on stage. Playing guitar is no longer just a joy, it's a battle, he once said. But the deepest pain wasn't physical. In April 2022, his wife, Steve Morse, was diagnosed with cancer. No press release. No fundraising campaign, no tears on social media. Steve stayed silent, and by July that year he officially stepped away from Deep Purple after 28 years, over 1,000 performances and millions of fans across the globe. He didn't leave to rest. He left to do something few in the rock world have ever done. Choose the one he loves over the stage. I can't keep touring while the one I love needs me most. Short sentence, but perhaps the biggest decision of his life. He left the lights behind, the crowds, a position no one could replace. Steve Morse returned to his quiet home in Ocala, Florida, where he once played guitar in open fields, where his wife was undergoing treatment, and where each passing day became a new kind of note, one of care, of patience, and of love that didn't need words. In a rock world filled with broken love stories, divorces after tours, relationships abandoned for fame, Steve Morse chose the opposite path, and he walked it to the end. Physical pain may have made his hands slower, but not for 1 second did he stop living as an artist, and if it meant trading all glory for one enduring love, he would do it again without hesitation. Personal life offstage: Steve Morse doesn't live like a legend. He lives like an ordinary man. So unassuming that if you passed him on the street, you probably wouldn't guess he once played guitar for one of the greatest rock bands in history. No designer clothes, no flashy cars, no headline-making statements. He resides on a small farm in Ocala, Florida, where mornings begin with tending the garden and late afternoons end with guitar sounds echoing from a self-built home studio. There lives his wife Janine, the woman who stood by him long before any fame and the biggest reason he left Deep Purple without looking back. They don't speak much about each other in interviews. Their love is quiet, complete, and exists much like Morse's music, deep, without the need to be displayed. Few people know that before returning to music full-time, Steve briefly worked as a commercial pilot in the late 1980s. It wasn't an escape from music, but a necessary pause, a detour to reset emotionally. To him, flying was much like playing guitar. It demanded control, emotion, and the ability to see beyond the horizon. That mindset helped him stay grounded, balancing life within the often chaotic, unforgiving world of music. Even years later he continued flying, not to prove anything, but simply because it felt like meditation. Another way of understanding the world. Though private, Morse never disconnected from the community. He continued to teach small classes, talk with students, write instructional books, and share his guitar knowledge through nonprofit projects. He never saw himself as a celebrity, just someone who walked the path a bit earlier and was willing to stay behind to lift up those coming after. He never treated music as a tool for self-assertion. To him, music was a way to exist, and life, without being tied to some note or melody, would feel empty. Now in his 70s, while many peers have retired or withdrawn from the spotlight, Steve Morse continues to quietly create. Not to become more famous, not to make money, but because he simply cannot not create. Just like he cannot stop loving, caring for, and holding on to the things that matter most. Music, a home, and peace. Recent years. Since leaving Deep Purple in 2022, Steve Morse has not stood on grand stages or embarked on grueling world tours, but if you think he's retired, you'd be mistaken. In truth, Morse has never been so busy, so freely busy. He returned to his quiet home in Ocala, Florida, where there are no cheering crowds, no tour schedules, but the sound of nature, the gentle hum of guitar strings each morning. And a home studio where he continues to compose, experiment, and live as a true artist. Throughout 2023 and 2024, Morse quietly released a series of unique projects. He unveiled a collection of abstract visual art pieces with titles like Northern Lights and Plasma Channel, not flashy, but warmly embraced by art enthusiasts and the guitar community alike. Alongside that, he collaborated with Katia Arts to create jewelry from old guitar strings, bracelets, pendants, and Valentine's gifts made from the very strings that once rang out on stage with Deep Purple and flying colors. For Steve, anything can become art, so long as it carries the breath of sound. And he didn't stop there. In 2024, he published a guitar technique book, accompanied by nearly 100 audio tracks personally recorded by him, a work both scholarly and reflective. Welcomed by the guitar world as a treasure trove. Morse didn't boast about the book. He simply shared. In early 2025, Steve Morse made a surprise appearance on the single Save Me by Kings Point, a young rock band from Croatia. No big promotions, no bold credits. He played a short solo, just a few bars, but enough for listeners to instantly recognize that sound was still there, refined, powerful, and achingly soulful. Then in July 2025, he accepted an invitation to teach at Guitar Workshop Plus in Nashville, not as a guest artist, but as a real teacher, sitting down with students, breaking down phrasing, picking, and the note patterns he'd crafted over decades. No microphone, no spotlight. Just the guitar, and a man who had lived through glory and grief, now passing on the deepest thing he's ever known: how to play a single note with your whole heart. Now in his 70s, Steve Morse has nothing left to prove. And the most beautiful part is, he keeps going. Not performing out of obligation, not writing to please, but simply because he still has something to say, and he chooses to say it through music. As he always has, legacy and influence. Steve Morse is not a name you'll find on the Billboard charts this month or the next. Nor is he a regular on those glossy guitar legend lists recognized by the general public, like Hendrix, Clapton, or Page. But in the real world of music, where players dissect chord structures, feel the nuance of phrasing, and navigate harmonic layers like invisible architecture, Steve Morse is a landmark. For over half a century, he has brought to rock music something rare: the precision of science, the freedom of improvisation, and the humility of a lifelong student. From the wordless harmonies of Dixie Dregs to the brief but effective revival of Kansas to Deep Purple's grand transformation post-Blackmore and then Flying Colors. At every phase, Steve Morse left a mark, quiet but indelible. It's the way he combines world-class technique with deeply emotional music. It's the compositional mind that treats each note as essential, with no room for excess. It's the unwavering refusal to compromise, even in a world that craves simplicity. He is one of only 3 people ever inducted into Guitar Players Hall of Fame, alongside Steve Howe and Eric Johnson, after winning Best Overall Guitarist 5 years in a row. John Petrucci names him as his biggest influence. Sean Lane, once dubbed the fastest guitarist alive, called Morse one of the greatest artists of the era. Even Ritchie Blackmore, the man whose shoes Morse filled in Deep Purple, once admitted, Steve Morse is an extraordinary player. But perhaps what makes Steve Morse's legacy most unique isn't in the titles. It's not even in the technique. It's in the attitude. He represents a kind of artist that is vanishingly rare, one who doesn't live for the spotlight, doesn't pursue fame, and never trades principle for applause. To him, simply playing music is already the reward. And if he had to give up everything just to keep that freedom, he would. Steve Morse didn't change the world with a hit song. He changed the world of musicians who, because of him, learned to love every note they played. And to master sound instead of being mastered by it. And that is a legacy that never fades. Some artists are born to be celebrated, some chase the spotlight as if it were their reason to live, and then there are those, like Steve Morse, who choose to take a step back. Not because they lack talent, not because they fear confrontation, but because for them, playing music in its purest form matters more than any form of glory. Throughout his career, Steve Morse never tried to become a legend. He simply kept playing what he believed was right. And through that very silence, he became the musician professionals revere, the peer that masters call their equal, and the man that many fans, though late, learned to cherish only after he had stepped away from the stage. Maybe you've heard him play without knowing his name. Maybe you've seen him standing behind Ian Gillan and thought he was just another session guitarist. Maybe you passed him by, mistaking him for an ordinary man in a sea of extraordinary performers. But if you've ever heard, "Sometimes I feel like screaming," and felt your chest tighten during the final solo. If you've listened to Cruise Control and wondered, how can someone play guitar like they're painting? If you've seen a 70-year-old man invent custom gear just to keep playing despite broken hands, then perhaps you felt the deepest thing Steve Morse ever left behind. Not a song, not a technique, but a philosophy. I don't need to be named, I just want to be heard. And if you believe that music is not just to be heard, but to be understood, then many stories like this are still waiting for you here. Stories of artists who aren't mentioned enough but are worth remembering forever. Follow the channel to keep walking that path with me.